The operations floor is quietest at 0500 in that hour before the day shift starts filling the coffee pots and the phones remember how to ring. Weeks after the cookout, I stood at the back of that room with a paper cup going cold in my hand and watched the big boards cycle through their steady green, and I let myself think for exactly 1 minute about a single word. Sponge. For 20 years, my family had a word for me, and I let them keep it. It was easier than the truth, and the truth was not mine to hand out. You learn that in my line of work. You learn that most of what people believe about you is a story they built for their own comfort, and that you can spend your whole life trying to correct the record, or you can spend it doing the work, but you cannot do both at the same time. I chose the work. I told myself I chose it for good reasons. Some of those reasons were even true. The rest of them were just fear wearing the uniform of principle. And it took me 2 decades and 1 very bad afternoon to tell the difference. The night crew moved behind me in the low blue light, 3 people at their stations, headsets on, voices down, the ordinary music of a watch floor holding steady through the dead hours. I had spent more of my adult life in rooms like that one than in any house I had ever lived in. Rooms with no windows and no clocks on the wall, except the ones that told 6 kinds of time at once. Rooms where the whole point was that nothing happened, because when something happened in a room like that, it meant something had already gone very wrong somewhere out in the world. You asked me how it happened, and to tell it right, I have to take you back to the Saturday in July when the word finally ran out of road. So let me put down the coffee and walk you back to my uncle's backyard, to the paper plates and the smoking grill and the 30 relatives who had all heard the story, so many times they no longer heard it at all. Let me walk you back to the last afternoon I was ever going to be invisible, though I did not know it yet, though I had gone there believing it would be exactly like all the ones before. It was the kind of afternoon that looks like a commercial for the Idea family. There were 2 coolers sweating in the grass, and a folding table sagging under foil pans of potato salad and baked beans and a sheet cake nobody had cut yet. And someone had strung a line of little paper flags between the porch posts that snapped when the wind came through off the fields behind the subdivision. It was 90 degrees and the air smelled like charcoal and cut grass, and the particular sweetness of soda spilled on hot concrete. Children ran a loop between the swing set and the back steps. Somewhere, a radio played the same station it had played at every one of these afternoons, my whole life. My Uncle Roy stood at the grill the way he had stood at every grill of my childhood. Tongs in one hand, a can of soda in the other, holding court over a loose ring of nephews and cousins who laughed at the right places because that was the toll you paid to stand near him. He was 66 years old that summer, and he still filled a yard the way he had at 40. A big, loud man who had decided a long time ago that the best way to feel tall was to find the shortest person in the room and stand next to them. I sat at the far picnic table with a glass of iced tea I had not touched, and I watched him work the crowd, and I already knew the shape of what was coming because it came every year. Roy did not like a table he was not the center of, and I had made the tactical error that afternoon of being quiet. And quiet was a thing Roy could not stand for long because quiet in another person felt to him like a room he had not been invited into. So he found me across the yard, the way he always did, and he raised his voice, just enough to carry over the radio and the children and the hiss of the grill. "Don't mind Marion over there," he said, and the ring of cousins turned to look. "She's a sponge. We've carried her for years. Don't let the quiet fool you. That's just what it looks like when somebody's got nothing to do and nowhere to be." My Aunt Sandra, at his elbow, gave the little laugh she always gave, the one that agreed with him before he finished the sentence. My cousin Todd smirked into his cup and said something to the man beside him that made the man snort. And my mother Barbara sat 2 seats down from me and looked at her plate and did not say anything, because she had not said anything in 20 years and the muscles for it had gone slack from disuse. I reached for the iced tea. I had learned a long time ago that the smallest muscles are the ones that give you away. The jaw, the little cords in the neck, the skin at the corner of the eyes. So I moved none of them. I lifted the glass, I drank, I set it back down inside the ring of water it had left on the wood. My face did the thing I had trained it to do across 1,000 harder rooms than this one. It did nothing at all. It gave him nothing to push against, which is the only way I have ever found to make a man like Roy eventually run out of breath. The tongs clicked shut in his hand like a period at the end of his sentence. And no one at that cookout corrected him, and the little paper flags snapped in the wind, and the afternoon rolled on over the top of me the way it had every year of my life. I remember thinking, that is that, one more summer paid for. I remember believing I would drive home in a few hours, the same woman who had driven in. I have never been more wrong about an afternoon in my life. You would have looked at me at that picnic table and seen exactly what Roy told you to see. A woman in her 40s in a plain gray shirt, no jewelry to speak of, sensible shoes, a canvas bag at her feet. A person who blended into the fence line. That was on purpose. That was, in fact, a skill I had worked at for 20 years, the way other people work at a golf swing. I had spent my whole adult life learning to be the calmest and least interesting thing in any given room. Because in my work, the calm person is the one everyone else studies themselves against, and you cannot be that person if you are also busy being seen. A watch floor at 3 a.m. during a real event does not need a hero. It needs one person whose heart rate does not move, whose voice does not climb, who asks the next question in the same flat tone, whether the news is good or catastrophic. I had made myself into that person on purpose, hour by hour, year by year, and the making of it had quietly rebuilt me. The stillness I wore at Roy's picnic table was not surrender. It was the same stillness I wore in the worst rooms of my life. He simply could not tell the two apart because he had never seen the worst rooms, and never would. What Roy could not see because he had never once looked was the bag at my feet. There were 2 phones in that bag. One of them was mine, the ordinary one, with photographs and a grocery list and a text from my dentist about a cleaning. The other one was not mine in any way that mattered. It belonged to the job, and the job did not sleep, and so the phone did not either. I owned 2 phones. One of them decided how the rest of my life would go, and I never let it leave my hand for long. I had it in my hand then, in fact, under the lip of the table where no one could see it, the way another person might worry a coin or a wedding ring. I was on call that weekend. I was, that particular Saturday, the on-call commander for a standing headquarters whose whole reason to exist was to be ready on the worst day, the day no one wants and everyone plans for. When it was my weekend, I did not drink, I did not travel more than a set distance from a certain building, and I did not turn that phone off. Not for a wedding, not for a funeral, and certainly not for a cookout where the main course was me. There is a discipline to being on call that most people never have to learn. You are at the party, and you are not at the party. You clock the exits out of habit. You know, without looking, how long the drive would take from wherever you are standing back to the room, and you keep that number updated in the back of your mind the way you keep track of your own heartbeat. The first time I ever carried that phone, years earlier, I had jumped every time it buzzed, my whole body flooding cold. By that summer at Roy's cookout, I had carried it long enough that the fear had gone quiet and professional, folded down small and kept in a pocket where I could reach it fast but did not have to look at it. That is what mastery of a thing like this actually looks like from the outside. It looks like a bored woman at a picnic table. It looks like nothing at all. The stillness that Roy read as emptiness was the most expensive thing I owned, paid for in years of nights I will never describe to anyone at a cookout. And he mistook the price tag for a blank. You laugh at the right moments and you pass the potato salad and some cool, quiet part of you never leaves the door. Everyone at that table thought I had nowhere to be. That was the joke. That was, in a way, the whole engine of the joke, that Marion drifted through life with no appointments and no weight, borrowing money and space and patience from people with real lives. And I sat there holding a phone that could reorder my entire year with one line of text, and I let them think it, because the alternative was to explain. And I had decided a long time ago that I would not explain. Paige slid onto the bench beside me halfway through the afternoon. She was my younger cousin, Todd's much younger sister, 28, and still soft enough at the edges to notice a person sitting alone at the far end of a loud yard. "You okay over here?" she asked. Just that. And she waited for the answer, actually waited, her eyes on my face and not scanning the crowd for someone more interesting to talk to. She was the only one who ever asked me a question and waited for the answer. Everyone else in that family asked questions the way you throw a ball at a wall to have it come back to them. "How are you?" they would say, and then talk for 20 minutes about themselves before I had finished the first word. Paige asked like she meant it because she did. "I'm all right, Paige," I said. "Just tired." "You're always tired," she said, not unkindly, picking at the label on her water bottle. "You work too hard at whatever it is you won't tell anybody about. You know they think that's suspicious, right? That you never say what you do. Dad's got a whole theory." "I'm sure he does," I said. "It's not a nice theory." "It never is," I said, and she laughed a little, and I almost smiled at that. She was closer to the truth in one sentence than her father had been in 20 years. I set the working phone face up on the table beside my plate where I could see the screen, and I kept my hand near it. And Paige looked at the plain black rectangle and did not ask what it was, and I loved her a little for that. In a family of people who could not stand a closed door, she was the only one who had ever learned to let a thing stay private without deciding it was a crime. To understand why a grown woman sat still and took it, you have to go back to where the story started, because the story was older than most of the people laughing at it that afternoon. Half the cousins in that yard had been children or not yet born when the thing that Roy built his story out of actually happened. They had inherited the joke the way you inherit a piece of furniture, without ever asking where it came from. It started in 2005. I was 23 years old. I had been commissioned the year before, a brand new second lieutenant with a haircut that did not suit me, and a duffel bag, and a great deal of certainty about the world that the world had not yet gotten around to correcting. And I had, in the middle of all that, made the ordinary human mistake of marrying young and marrying wrong, a boy I had known since high school who wanted a wife who stayed put, and I was never going to stay put, and the marriage came apart the way those things do, quietly and expensively, over the course of one long bad winter. The Army does not stop for your bad winter. I had orders moving me from one post to the next, and in the gap between them, with a household to break down and a lease ending and nowhere to put myself for a stretch of weeks, I did what any 23-year-old with a mother 2 hours away would do. I moved back into my mother's spare room for 7 months while I sorted out the wreckage and waited for a set of quarters and a report date to line up. 7 months. A hinge, not a home. I paid her rent she did not want to take. I bought the groceries, I fixed the gutter and repainted the back bedroom and drove her to her appointments, and then my orders came through and I left, and I never spent another night under that roof for the 20 years that followed. But Roy was the loud center of the family then, in his prime, and Roy took one look at his niece carrying boxes back into her mother's house and decided, out loud, in front of everyone, what it meant. "Back home again," he said, from the same aluminum lawn chair he always sat in, the one with the frayed webbing. "Some people just can't launch. You watch, she'll be here at Christmas too." That was it. That was the whole seed. But I was not there at Christmas. I was at a post 4 states away, learning a job that would one day put me in charge of rooms Roy could not imagine. And it did not matter at all, because the story had already left the station, and the story did not need me in it. Roy repeated it at Thanksgiving, and repeated it at the 4th of July, and repeated it at every christening, and every graduation, and every funeral. And each time he repeated it, it grew a little. The way a fish grows in the telling, until the 7 real months had become a permanent condition, until the young lieutenant sorting out a divorce had become the sponge who had never held a job and lived off her poor mother and drifted, always drifting, never launching. A story does not need to be true to be repeated. It only needs to be useful to the person telling it. And that story was enormously useful to Roy. It made him the man who worked hard while others drifted, the responsible one, the anchor. It gave the whole family a soft target to feel superior to at every gathering, a low bar they could all clear just by showing up with a casserole and a paycheck and a mortgage. I was not a person to them. I was a function. I was the thing you measured yourself against and felt good. For years I told myself it did not cost me anything, because I was rarely there to hear it. I lived far away. I came home twice a year, 3 times in a hard year, and I could sit through one afternoon of it and drive back to my real life where people called me by my rank and trusted me with their worst days. But it did cost me. It cost me a family. It cost me the version of these gatherings where I might have been known. Every year I chose the drive home over the fight, and every year the choosing got a little more automatic until I was not choosing anymore. I was just a woman who went quiet at a certain picnic table out of a habit so old I had stopped being able to see it. I watched Todd, that afternoon at the cookout, lean over to his own 2 kids and say a softer version of the same line, nodding toward me, teaching the next generation exactly where the bar was and exactly who was under it. And I understood, watching him do it, that it had never once been about the facts. The facts had left the building in 2005. This was liturgy now. This was a thing the family said to remind itself who it was, a call and a response, and I was the low note they all sang against to feel the harmony. The room had been comfortable with the wrong version for so long that the right one would have felt, to them, like an attack. That is the cruelest part of a story like that. By the time the truth is finally ready to be told, telling it makes you the aggressor. The person who has been lied about for 20 years becomes, in the moment she finally speaks, the one who ruined a perfectly nice afternoon. There was one 4th of July, years before, when I nearly broke. My father was still alive then, quieter than his brother, always quieter, and I had come home in the middle of a hard stretch, running on 3 weeks of bad sleep from a mission that had not gone the way anyone wanted. And Roy had done his usual routine, the sponge, the drifting, the fridge jokes, and my father had laughed along with everyone else. And something about seeing my own father laugh had put my hand halfway to the truth. I had the words loaded. I could feel them. And then I looked at my father laughing, easy and unguarded, the most relaxed I had seen him in years, and I understood that the story was the thing holding the whole afternoon up, that it was load-bearing, that if I pulled it out, the whole day would come down, and my father would be embarrassed in front of his brother, and I would be the one who did that to him. So I swallowed it. I drove back to my post the next morning, and I cried once, hard, in a gas station parking lot outside Dayton. And then I put my face back on and went to work. My father died 2 years after that, still believing his brother's version of me. That is the real price of a story like Roy's. It is not the laughter. It is the funerals you attend as a stranger to your own family. So I did not speak. I reached for my iced tea, and I moved none of the small muscles, and I waited for the day to be over. I had no idea the day was about to speak for me. The working phone lit up at 14 minutes past 3 in the afternoon. I know the time exactly because I looked at it the way I always look at it, and I will remember it the way you remember the times that split your life into a before and an after. The screen came alive, face up on the picnic table, and the sound it made was not the sound my other phone made. It was a short, flat tone, 2 notes, low, then high. And I had heard that tone in drills 100 times, and in reality, only a handful. And my body knew the difference between the drill and the real thing before my mind had finished reading the words. My hand was on the phone before the second note finished sounding. There was a string of characters across the top of the screen, a code, the kind of code that means nothing to anyone who has not been taught it and means everything to the very few who have. I had drilled that code so many times that reading it was less like reading and more like a door opening in my chest. And under the code was one line from the staff duty officer, a sergeant first class named Owen Petrie, whose steadiness I trusted more than most people's love, a man I had stood beside through 3 of these in 2 years. The line said, "Activation is real, not a drill. Cars are already rolling to your location. Window is tight. Acknowledge." I read it twice. Not because I did not understand it, but because reading a thing like that a second time is how you make your hands stop wanting to shake. There is a trick to it. You read the words again slowly and you let the training take the wheel from the fear, and by the second reading the fear has sat back down and the officer has stood up. The word on the screen meant a real thing was happening to real people somewhere. Right then, while the little paper flags snapped over Roy's backyard and the children ran their loop between the swing set and the steps. And it meant that I was the person who was supposed to be in the room when it happened. Not a person, the person. The seat had my name on it that weekend, and the seat was empty, and empty was not allowed, and empty had a clock on it. I typed one word back with my thumb, steady now, the training in the driver's seat. Acknowledged. Then I stood up. I did it quietly. I did not scrape the bench or knock the table or say anything that would turn a head. I bent down and picked up my canvas bag, and I put the ordinary phone into it and kept the working phone in my hand. And I stepped around the end of the picnic table toward my mother, already running the drive time in my head, already stripping the afternoon off myself like a coat. "Mom," I said low, just for her. "I have to go right now. I'm sorry to leave you here." Barbara looked up at me, confused, blinking, because in her version of things I never had anywhere to go either. She had spent 20 years half believing Roy's story herself. Not out of malice, but out of the slow erosion that comes from hearing a thing said 1,000 times by a loud man while you say nothing. "Go where, honey?" she said. "You just got here. We haven't even cut the cake." And before I could answer, Roy's voice came across the yard, because Roy could not let a person leave a table without a comment. It was against his religion. "Big plans, sweetheart?" he called, and the cousins turned again, sensing sport, the way a crowd turns at the sound of a bottle about to break. "Somebody need their fridge moved? You finally get a job hauling boxes for a real business." The laughter started up, easy and warm and cruel, the sound of 30 people who had done this so many times it felt like a tradition, like a thing you do at a cookout, like cutting the cake. Sandra laughed. Todd laughed. 2 of the older cousins I had actually loved as a child laughed. It rolled across the yard toward me in a wave. And down the street, past the parked cars and the mailbox and the neighbor's basketball hoop lying on its side in the grass, 3 sets of headlights turned the corner in a single tight line and did not slow down. I saw them over the fence, over the heads of the laughing crowd. 3 black shapes moving up the ordinary suburban street with the smooth, unhurried speed of things that have somewhere important to be. And I felt the ground of the whole afternoon tilt underneath the picnic table. And no one else at that cookout had noticed a single thing. Here is the thing no one tells you about being the family joke. The hardest 90 seconds are not the ones where they laugh at you. The hardest 90 seconds are the ones right before you leave, when every reflex you have built over 20 years tells you to make it smooth, to soften it, to apologize your way out of the yard, so that no one's afternoon is spoiled by the terrible inconvenience of your having, for once, somewhere to be. Roy was not done. He never left a laugh on the table when there was more to be squeezed out of it. "Sit down, Marion," he said, grinning now, spreading his arms to the crowd, like a man landing a bit he had rehearsed in the mirror. "Nobody's buying the busy act. You've never had anywhere to be in your whole life. 20 years I've watched you drift in and drift out. Always about to go somewhere, never actually going. Sit down and eat. It's free. Everything's always free for you. That's kind of your whole thing." The laughter came again, and it was worse this time because it had a shape now, because he had turned my leaving into the punchline of the afternoon, and the crowd went with him the way crowds do. Sandra was laughing with her hand on his arm. Todd had his phone half out of his pocket, and I did not know yet whether he meant to film me or was just fidgeting with it. But the sight of it turned something cold in my stomach. My mother was looking at her plate, and Paige, 2 seats down, had stopped laughing and was watching me with a small frown, the only person at that whole cookout whose face had a question on it instead of an answer, the only one who had noticed that I had gone very still in a new way. And I felt it. I want to be honest with you about that, because if I only tell you the calm parts, I am telling you a lie. I felt the 20-year reflex rise up in me like heat off the grill, the pull to stop, to turn, to say something small and placating, to explain. I felt the sentences forming behind my teeth. "It's not what you think, Roy. I actually have a fairly serious job. I'm actually somewhat important, if you had ever once bothered to ask. Those cars are for me." I felt myself wanting to reach into my chest and pull out the truth and lay it on the picnic table in front of him, still beating, so that he would finally stop. For one breath, I wanted to explain myself, and wanting to explain yourself is the oldest trap there is. Explaining is just asking permission to be who you already are. It hands the other person the gavel. It says, "Here is my evidence, here is my case. Now please, please, rule in my favor and agree to see me." And I had stopped asking that family for permission a long, long time ago. I had just forgotten for one hot second, in the laughter and the charcoal smoke, that I had stopped. I thought, in that breath, about all the times I had tried to explain, years earlier, before I learned better. The Christmas I had mentioned a deployment, and Roy had said, "Oh, they let you go over there," and turned it into a joke about paperwork. The time I had tried to describe my actual job and watched his eyes go flat and bored, and then watched him change the subject to his own back surgery. I had learned, slowly and at real cost, that you cannot explain your way into being seen by a person who has decided that not seeing you is load-bearing for their whole personality. So I closed my mouth on the explanation. I did not turn around. I did not give Roy the fight he was fishing for. The one where I raised my voice and he got to lean back in his chair and say, "See? There she goes. Always so dramatic, always making everything about her." I let the sentence die in my throat where it belonged, and I turned toward the front of the house instead, toward the side gate and the driveway and the sound, just now reaching the backyard under the radio and the laughter, of 3 engines idling at the curb. I stopped at the side gate with one hand on the latch, and I gave myself exactly 2 seconds to decide how I was going to do this. 2 seconds is enough. In my work, you learn that most decisions that matter get made in about 2 seconds, and that the rest of the time is just your mind building a courthouse around a verdict it already reached. Because there is a way to do this that is about them, and a way to do it that is about the work, and I have watched good people ruin themselves by choosing the first one. I could have made them come to me. I could have stood in the middle of Roy's backyard by the sagging table and let Major Shaw and the security detail walk all the way across the grass to find me, past the grill and the coolers and the swing set, so that every single relative got a long, slow, unmissable look at the men in dark suits coming for the sponge. It would have been satisfying. I will not pretend the thought did not cross my mind, because it did, bright and hot and human. 20 years is a very long time to be a punchline, and there was a version of me standing at that gate that wanted the whole yard to watch the correction land in slow motion, wanted to see Roy's face do the thing I knew it was about to do, and wanted to see it up close. But that version of me is not the officer they trained. And more than that, that version of me would have been using a real emergency. A real bad day happening to real people somewhere out in the world as a prop in a 20-year-old family argument. Somewhere a situation was unfolding that had made grown professionals roll 3 cars to a cookout to retrieve me inside a tight window, and the idea of stretching that out, of milking it, of turning other people's crisis into my personal vindication tour across my uncle's lawn made me feel ill. I would rather have stayed the sponge forever than do that. The work is not mine to spend on my own feelings. That is the first thing and the last thing. So I decided the other way. I decided I would not say a single word about who I was. I would not announce myself. I would not make a speech. I would let the next 4 minutes say it for me, plainly and without my help, and then I would leave, and I would meet the cars at the curb instead of dragging them through the yard, and I would spare my mother the spectacle and refuse Roy the scene he would have dined out on for another 20 years. I glanced back once. Just once. My mother was half standing now, one hand flat on the picnic table, her face full of a confusion that was starting to curdle into something else. Something like alarm, because mothers know the difference between a daughter walking off in a huff and a daughter moving with real purpose toward 3 idling cars. She had seen me walk away from that table angry before. She had never seen me walk away from it like this, and some old animal part of her knew the difference. "It's all right, Mom," I said, low enough that only she could hear it over the noise. "Finish your plate. I've got this. I promise you, it's all right." And then I lifted the latch on the gate and stepped through toward the street, and the first sedan rolled to a stop at the curb exactly as my shoe came down on the driveway. The timing so clean it was almost funny, and behind me the backyard had gone strangely, suddenly quiet, because 30 people had finally, all at once, noticed the cars. There were 3 of them, black, clean, unremarkable in the exact way that expensive and serious things are unremarkable, parked nose to tail along the curb in front of Roy's ordinary house with their engines running low. And out of the middle one, before it had fully stopped rocking on its springs, came Major Elliot Shaw. Shaw was 33 years old and looked like he had been cut from the pages of a manual, and I had never in 2 years of working beside him seen him move as fast as he moved up that driveway. He had a folder tucked under one arm and an earpiece in, and the particular focused expression of a man who has been trying to reach someone for 11 straight minutes and has just, at last, laid eyes on them. Behind him, holding the rear door of the lead car open, stood Sergeant First Class Owen Petrie, the same Petrie whose message was still glowing on the phone in my hand. Older, heavier through the shoulders, with the flat, unbothered, immovable calm of a man who had held far worse doors than this one, and would hold far worse still. "Colonel Keller," Shaw said, and his voice carried up the driveway and over the fence and straight into the suddenly silent backyard, clean and carrying as a struck bell. "We've been trying to reach you for 11 minutes, ma'am. The line to your cell wouldn't hold. We need to move. The window's closing. Give me the short version on the way, I said, and I was already walking, already reaching for the folder, already halfway gone in my head, already in the room I was supposed to be in, running the first 3 questions I would ask when I got there. Shaw fell into step on my left and started talking low and fast, the way you brief a commander who is walking, hitting only the load-bearing facts, and Petrie swung the door wider, and my whole body had already changed. Whatever had been sitting at that picnic table, it was not the thing walking down the driveway now. The driveway version stood straighter. The driveway version had a different face. Shaw's briefing came at me in the clipped shorthand we used when a commander was moving. He gave me the timeline, the number of people affected, the 2 decisions that were waiting on my signature, and the 1 piece of bad news he had been holding back until I was close enough to the car to absorb it without breaking stride. I asked him 2 questions. He answered the first one, and told me, honestly, that no one had a good answer to the second one yet, which was exactly why they had rolled 3 cars to a cookout to come and get me. That is the job. You are not called because everything is fine. You are called precisely at the moment when the people who are very good at their jobs have run out of certainty, and someone has to stand in the gap where the certainty used to be and make the calls anyway. I had spent 20 years learning to stand in that gap without flinching, and Roy had spent the same 20 years telling a yard full of people that I had never had anywhere to be. Behind me, I heard the side gate bang. I heard Roy come through it. He had followed me. Of course he had followed me. He could not let a thing happen in his own front yard without being at the center of it, and he came down the driveway, still half in his cookout voice, still reaching for the register that had ruled every gathering of my life. But the register was not working anymore, because the crowd he was performing for had gone completely silent and drifted to the fence line to watch, and a performer knows, in his body, when he has lost the room. "Move where?" Roy said, and there was a crack running through it now, the first true crack I had heard in that voice in 20 years. "What is this? Marion, what is this? Who are these people? This is a family cookout." Petrie stepped. Not fast, not hard, just a single economical shift of his weight that put his body cleanly between my uncle and the open door of the car, and he said, in a voice that was flat and even and not unkind, the voice of a man who does this for a living and has no need to raise it. "Sir, please step back from the vehicle." "This is my niece," Roy said, and he actually said it like it was an argument, like the fact of me being his niece was a trump card that beat whatever these men in their dark suits were holding. "This is my brother's girl. She doesn't. She's not. She hauls boxes. She lives off her mother." "Colonel," Shaw said again, ignoring Roy so completely that it was almost its own kind of verdict, holding the folder open for me at the door of the car. "The general is already holding on the secure line. He wants you read in before you're through the front gate. He said, and I quote, 'Tell Keller to stop letting her family answer her phone.'" And there it was, the word, said a second time and a third time. Colonel, landing in that driveway in front of 30 people who had spent the entire afternoon calling me a sponge. And I did not look at a single one of them. Somewhere behind the word general, my uncle had gone quiet at last. All the way quiet, the tongs clicking, joke landing, room-ruling voice, finally and completely out of road. I did not look for their faces. I could feel them rearrange the whole afternoon behind me anyway. I could feel it the way you feel weather change before the first drop falls, a pressure drop across the entire yard. 30 people silently taking 20 years of a story and trying to fit it against the thing they were watching with their own eyes, and finding that it would not fit, that it had never fit, that they had been handed the wrong file 2 decades ago by a loud man in a lawn chair and had never once thought to open it and check. I took the folder from Shaw. I glanced at the top line, and the top line straightened my spine the way it always does, because the top line was not about me at all. It was about the people on the worst day of their lives, who were, at that moment, waiting for a room full of us to get our act together and be worth their trust. Todd, at the fence, had his phone half up, and I saw him lower it slowly, all the way down, and slide it into his pocket, as if he had realized somewhere in the middle of raising it that he did not understand what he was looking at, well enough to know what to do with it, that this was not a thing you posted, that he was out of his depth in his own front yard. "Let's go," I said to Shaw. I got into the car. Petrie closed the door in the quiet, a single solid expensive sound, and the last thing I saw of that cookout through the glass was my mother standing all the way up now at the far picnic table with both hands pressed to her mouth. And for the first time in 20 years, there was not one single person in that yard who had a word for me. I was not there for the part that came after in the backyard. I was in the car, and then I was in the room, and I did not think about Roy's cookout again for 11 hours, because there were other people's lives on the boards, and they had first claim on my attention. But my mother told me the rest of it later, in pieces, over the phone that night, and then over lunch weeks after. And Paige filled in the gaps her mother left out, and so I can tell you how the word finally died in that yard. For a long moment after the 3 cars pulled away from the curb, my mother said, no one on that patio said anything at all. The grill hissed, the radio played, the little paper flags snapped in the wind. 30 people stood at the fence line holding paper plates of potato salad and looked at the empty curb where 3 black cars had been. And then slowly, the way a field of sunflowers turns, they all looked at Roy. Because Roy was the one who had built the story, brick by brick, summer by summer, and Roy was the one who was going to have to say something about it now, in front of all of them, with the evidence of how wrong he had been, still fresh as tire tracks on the street. And Roy, my mother said, opened his mouth and closed it. He went back to the grill. He picked up his tongs. He tried, she said, to start the afternoon back up, to say something about the burgers being ready, to pretend that a motorcade had not just come and taken his sponge of a niece out of his own front yard while a young man in a dark suit called her colonel 3 times and told her a general was holding on the line. But the afternoon would not restart. Some things you cannot unring, and that was one of them, and every person in that yard could feel that it was. And then my mother did the thing she had not done in 20 years. Barbara Keller, who had spent 2 decades looking down at her plate while a loud man rewrote her daughter, stood up at that picnic table with her hands shaking, and she said it, out loud in front of everyone, in a voice she told me later she did not even recognize as her own. She's a colonel, Roy, my mother said, into the silence over the hiss of the grill. She has been somebody this whole time. She has been somebody for 20 years, while you sat in that chair and made her the joke of every dinner we ever had. You just liked the other story better, because it was easier for you to be the big man if she was the small one. And I let you tell it. I sat here and I ate my food, and I let you tell it about my own daughter, and I am ashamed of that, and I am finished being ashamed of the wrong thing in this family. My mother said the yard was so quiet after that, she could hear the neighbor's sprinkler ticking 2 houses down. She said Sandra put a hand on Roy's arm, and Roy shook it off, not angry, just lost. A big man in a small chair who had discovered all at once that the ground he had stood on for 20 years was painted on. She said Todd took his phone out of his pocket and looked at it and put it away again like it had gone hot in his hand. 2 days later, I got a voicemail from Roy. It was 90 seconds long, and it was 90% bluster. It was all about how nobody ever tells him anything. How was he supposed to know? Why did I keep secrets from my own family? As if my having a whole career were a thing I had done to him personally, a slight against his hospitality. But in the last 10 seconds of it, under all the bluster, there was something I had never once heard in that voice before. A small, uncertain, wavering note. The sound of a man standing at the very edge of understanding that he had gotten something enormous wrong, and had gotten it wrong not by accident, but on purpose, for 2 decades, at the expense of a person who had never done a thing to earn it. He did not apologize. He did not have the tools for it yet. But the note was there, and I had never heard it, and I sat in my car in a parking garage and listened to those last 10 seconds 3 times. And Paige texted me that same night. She wrote, I always knew you were the calmest person in every single room. Now I know why. I saved that text. I still have it. Of everything that came out of that afternoon, the folder and the cars and my mother finally standing up, that one plain sentence from the one cousin who had always waited for my answer is the thing I go back and read. The rest of the family sorted itself out the way families do, unevenly and in the dark. Sandra called my mother the next week, my mother told me, and spent most of the call defending Roy and the last 2 minutes of it not defending him at all, which for Sandra was a revolution. Todd never said a word to me directly, but he stopped telling the story and he took his kids aside, Paige said, and told them that their Aunt Marion had an important job and that the old jokes were finished, which was more than I had ever expected from Todd, and I decided to let it count. A few of the older cousins sent the kind of careful, sideways messages that people send when they cannot quite say sorry but want you to know they have revised the file. Nobody threw a parade. Nobody needed to. What happened instead was quieter and more real than a parade. A story that 30 people had agreed on for 20 years simply lost its authority all at once, in an afternoon, and could not get it back, and everyone adjusted to the new weather without ever fully talking about it. The story Roy told for 20 years could not be told the same way ever again after that afternoon, and every single person at that table knew it. And that, far more than any card, any curb, more than the word Colonel said 3 times in a driveway, was the thing that actually changed. The activation ran for the better part of a week. I will not tell you the details of it, because the details are not mine to tell, and because they are not, in the end, the point of this story. The point is that a great many people worked very hard for a great many hours, so that a bad day for some strangers would not spiral into a far worse one. And that when it was finally over, most of those strangers never learned a single one of our names. And that this is the true shape of the work, and always has been. You do the thing, and the thing works, and no one claps, because if it works the way it is supposed to, most of the world never even finds out there was a thing to clap for. I sat in that windowless room in the middle of the 3rd night, in the long, flat stretch of hours when the crisis has stopped being an emergency and become a grind, and I had one of those quiet minutes that open up sometimes between the tasks, and I let myself feel, for the first time, what the afternoon had actually cost me. Because it did cost me something. That is the part the story leaves out when it wants to be a clean story about a woman getting her due. The recognition I had never once chased arrived on the worst possible afternoon in the worst possible way. Torn out of my hands by an emergency I could not control, and it cost me the last easy thing I owned, which was the ability to be invisible at my own family's table. I had liked being invisible. I know exactly how strange that sounds, but there's a real peace in being underestimated, in having no one expect a thing from you, in getting to sit at the far, quiet end of the table, and simply watch the people you came from be themselves. I had built a whole sheltered life in the shade of that low opinion, and in 4 minutes at a curb it had been knocked flat, and I understood that I was never going to get it back. The next cookout, and every cookout after it, I would be watched. I would be a story of a different kind now. There is a cost to that too, even when the new story is the true one. And there was another cost, one I did not expect and did not like admitting to. For 20 years, the low opinion had been a kind of armor. If they expected nothing of me, they could not be disappointed by me, and I could not fail in their eyes, because I had already failed there, permanently, in advance. Being the sponge was a floor I could not fall through. It was a strange, cold comfort, and I had leaned on it more than I ever told anyone, and now it was gone. Now there were expectations in that yard, real ones, and expectations can be disappointed, and some quiet, frightened part of me had preferred the safety of the basement to the exposure of the roof. It took me the better part of that week on the watch floor to understand that this was the last hold the old story had on me. That even after the cars and the folder and my mother standing up, a piece of me was still bargaining to keep the smallness, because the smallness had felt safe. I had to put that down too. It was the hardest thing I put down that year, and no one but me ever knew I was carrying it. Being right had never kept me warm. I want you to hear that plainly, because it is one of the truest things I know. Being right is a cold and lonely country, and I have spent a great deal of my life living in it. And it does not love you back. But I found, in that quiet minute in the middle of the 3rd night, with the boards holding green and the crisis bending slowly the right way, that I did not actually need the yard to say it was sorry. I did not need Roy to grovel or the cousins to line up single file and apologize for 20 years of laughing. What I needed was the room in front of me to hold. I needed the boards to stay green. I needed the people on the worst day of their lives to get to have a next day. And that I already had, and had had all along, and no lawn chair in Ohio had ever been able to give it to me or take it away. Shaw came by my chair a little after 0400 with 2 paper cups of coffee and set one down next to me without a word, which is its own quiet language on a watch floor at 4 a.m. "For what it's worth, ma'am," he said after a minute, looking at the boards and not at me, which is how men like Shaw say the real things. "Back at that house, those people looked like they'd seen a ghost." I thought about that. I thought about the fence line and the paper plates and the pressure dropping across the whole yard. "They had," I said. "Mine." Shaw nodded slowly and did not ask what I meant, and drank his coffee, And I turned back to the boards, and the work steadied me the way it always has and the way it always will. The way it did that whole long week and every hard week before it, holding me up the same as it had held me up my whole quiet, unwatched, unclapped for life. The activation stood down on a Thursday. The world went back to being the ordinary kind of place where you can plan a lunch and reasonably expect to keep it. And a few weeks after the cookout, when the dust had truly settled on all of it, my mother asked me to lunch, just the two of us, at a diner near her house, with cracked vinyl booths and terrible coffee that we had both loved my whole life. She had trouble getting to it. She turned her cup around a few times on its saucer, lined up the sugar packets, straightened her silverware. And then she said the thing she had never once said in 44 years of being my mother. "I should have said it a long time ago," Barbara said, and her hands were doing the shaking thing again, the way they had shaken in the yard. "I'm proud of you. I was always proud of you. I let a loud man talk right over the truth for 20 years because it kept the peace at dinner, and I told myself that keeping the peace was the loving thing to do, that a good mother holds the family together. And it was not the loving thing. It was the easy thing dressed up as the loving thing. And you paid for my easy thing every single holiday of your adult life, and I watched you pay for it, and I said nothing. And I am so sorry, Marion. I am so sorry." I reached across the cracked vinyl and took my mother's hand, which was still shaking a little, the way it had shaken when she finally stood up at that picnic table. 20 years late is still a thing you get to keep," I told her, and I meant it all the way down. Because you do not get to choose when the people you love finally see you clearly. You only get to choose whether you are still standing there with an open hand instead of a fist on the day they finally do. I had spent a long time deciding I would keep my hand open. It is the hardest discipline I know, harder than any drill, and it is the only one that has ever actually paid me back. We stayed in that booth for almost 2 hours. My mother asked me things she had never asked in 44 years, real questions, and she waited for the answers the way Paige always had. And I told her what I could, which was not everything, but was more than I had told anyone in that family in my whole adult life. I told her about the first deployment and the watch floor and the reason I had never married again. I told her about my father laughing at that 4th of July in the gas station outside Dayton, and she cried quietly into a paper napkin and did not try to defend herself or explain, which was its own kind of grace. When the check came, she reached for it, and I let her have it because letting your mother buy you a diner lunch is sometimes the most generous thing you can do, and because the word sponge had finally lost every last bit of its sting, and I could sit there and let her pay and feel nothing but loved. Roy and I are not close now. I want to be honest with you about that, because I do not want to hand you a neat bow that was never really tied. He is not a different man. A man does not become a different man at 66 because a motorcade came to his cookout. But he is a quieter one now, and quieter is not nothing. At a smaller gathering that fall, he came and stood near me by the drinks table, and he worked his way, stiffly, painfully, one hard sentence at a time, through the closest thing to an apology that a man like Roy has anywhere inside him. He said he had not known. He said he supposed he should have asked, sometime in 20 years, one single time. And then he said a few things about my father, his younger brother, who had died before any of this. Things I think he had needed to say out loud to somebody for a very long time about launching and not launching and which of the two brothers had really done which. I understood, listening to him, that the story he had told about me had never really been about me at all. It had been about him and his brother, and a fear he had carried since he was young that he was the one who had never truly launched. I could have made him work much harder for it. I could have kept a scoreboard, the way a person is entitled to keep a scoreboard after 20 years of being somebody's punchline. But I have learned that a scoreboard is just one more way of letting the people who hurt you set the terms of your peace, of keeping them at the center of your life long after they have lost the right to be there. And I was finished, all the way finished, letting Roy set my terms. "It's all right, Roy," I said. "Let's just have a plate and sit." And we did. We sat down at the same kind of table where he had called me a sponge for 20 summers, and we ate off the same kind of thin paper plates, and it was not warm exactly, and it was not the family I might have had in some other, kinder life. But it was honest, and honest was so much more than I had ever once gotten from that table before. I set the working phone face up beside my plate where I could see the screen because it was my weekend again, and no one at that table made a single joke about it because they all knew now exactly what it was, and I was welcome there at last instead of merely tolerated, which is a difference you can feel in your whole body when it finally arrives. Paige sat down across from me and grinned and said, "So, can you tell me what you actually do yet?" "No," I said, and she laughed, and it was a good laugh, a real one, and it was. I realized somewhere in the middle of it, the first time in 20 years that I had laughed at that table, too. I want to say something to you now, whoever you are, if you have stayed with me all the way to here. If you have ever been the joke at your own family's table, if the people who were supposed to know you best decided who you were a long time ago and never once thought to open the file back up and check whether it was still true, I want you to hear this, sir, from someone who lived 20 years inside exactly that story and came out the other side of it still standing. You do not owe anyone the proof of who you are. I spent 2 decades believing that the correction was mine to make. I believed that if I could just find the right words, or the right moment, or the right amount of evidence, I could hand my uncle the truth across a picnic table, and he would finally set the old story down, and the whole family would finally see me. And I was wrong about that, and I was wrong in a way that quietly cost me a great deal of peace over a great many years, because the correction was never mine to force. People do not put down a story about you because you argued them out of it in a good enough speech. They put it down only when reality itself gets too heavy for the story to keep holding up, and reality does that work on its own schedule, in its own time, never on yours. So do not spend your one and only life trying to convince people who have already decided not to see you. Do your work instead. Do it well, and do it especially when no one at all is clapping, because the work you do, when no one is watching and no one is keeping score, is the realest thing about you, realer than any title, realer than any car at any curb, realer than any word said 3 times in a driveway. Keep your dignity, which is the one single thing that no one can ever call a sponge and take away from you, the one thing that stays yours, whether they clap for it or laugh at it or never notice it at all. And then let the truth be patient, because it is patient, far more patient than you are, far more patient than the loudest man at the grill. It will arrive on its own, usually on an ordinary afternoon when you least expect it. Usually right at the moment when you have finally stopped needing it to. Let the doing speak. It always does, in the end. The end.